So I am Ryan Jarles. I'm one of the preservation planners here at the Landmark Society of Western New York. Um, I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, so I'll kind of just do a little background. Um, this is kind of a good overview of my favorite things here on these pictures I included. So historic preservation, you'll see the witch on the shirt there. Halloween's one of my favorite things, so this is a perfect time of year for me to be doing a presentation to you all. And then this photograph off to the side is a couple of people I used to work with the National Park Service. And then the woman in the black and white sweater there is a kind of a culmination of one of my third favorite things, which is history just in general. That's actually Cheney McKnight. I don't know if any of you know who she is, but I just want to give her a quick shout out. She's the founder of Not Your Mama's History. So she's an advocate for telling the stories of people of color, and is also somewhat of a performance artist in terms. And I just love everything she does. So I originally got into historic preservation at a super young age. I'm going to give a little bit of a background just so you know who's presenting to you. Because I actually started in the world of history around the age of 12. I started volunteering at the home of Andrew Jackson. It's called the Hermitage. And I was working there with a team to get youth involved in learning about and telling the stories of the enslaved inhabitants of that property. And that's kind of where my love of history began. And so when it was time to go to college, I was like, how can I, involve history while also involving old houses? Because I was still used to that, working at the Hermitage kind of feel. So I ended up going to Savannah, Georgia, where I got a degree in historic preservation from the Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD. And then I kind of just stayed in Savannah for a while. So I actually started working at a house museum there, doing historic preservation and working with them on creating an interpretation for their enslaved quarters on their property and growing their diverse history to talk to the public about. I then moved from there to the National Park Service. I was working for Fort Pulaski National Monument just outside of Savannah, Georgia, and that's where I got more into the technical side of historic preservation. So getting more into the maintenance and preservation plans. Also receiving training in masonry and woodwork, so more hands-on versions as well. And Savannah's a super small town. I don't know if any of you have been to Savannah, Georgia. It seems big, but it's actually super tiny. So you kind of get sucked in and trapped there once you get there. So I knew enough about preservation and I had become somewhat of an expert on the Savannah area itself. So the Metropolitan Planning Commission, which is a pseudo-government organization, not really working for the government, but hired kind of like as a contractor from the government to kind of take over all of their planning aspects. And so for them, I was the cultural resources planner. I worked with many hats. I did help on updating zoning ordinances regarding historic preservation. Single-handedly helped rewrite kind of on my own the entirety of the master planning guidelines for creating an ordinance for historic markers, monuments, public art, and murals within the city of Savannah. So that's kind of going through their approval process with city council right now, probably, I would assume. I haven't heard back yet. So I decided after a while of working there that I didn't really want to be in the South anymore. Biggest reason was because it's very hot down there and I'm not a heat person. So I accepted a position up here with the Landmark Society of Western New York as their preservation outreach coordinator. But as anyone in the planning field knows, you can't really get far from that. So I did switch over to being one of the preservation planners here at the Landmark Society. So that's me. So let's kind of move into, like I said, we're going to do a broad overview of historic preservation. So I'm going to start with early preservation. In reality, we're not that old when it comes to our country. We're essentially an infant in relation to other countries around the world. So we officially, as many know, became a country in 1776. But places like, let's talk about the United Kingdom, was founded in 927. So kind of a bit of a baby when it comes to historic preservation here in our country. So let's think about it. Our country was formed in 1776. And already in 1816, one of the earliest preservation efforts in the United States is coming about. And that's going to be the effort to save Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from demolition. So a number of organizations and associations that dealt with historic things in the country at that point made strong appeals, and the city of Philadelphia would eventually purchase that building and begin its preservation work. But really, people think about something else as the main effort for historic preservation's beginnings, and that's going to be in 1853. So if you look at the top left of this screen, you're going to see Mount Vernon. We're going to talk a bit more about it on a different slide, but the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association of the Union, that's what it was called originally, is generally considered the first preservation group organized in the United States. And again, that's founded in 1853 to save the deteriorating Mount Vernon. And you'll see pictures of that in just a little bit. In the late 1800s, you're seeing the federal government showing interest in preservation. And so that's going to be by protecting natural features, though, at the beginning. So that's when you're seeing places like Yellowstone National Park being established in 1872, and the beginning of programs to acquire Civil War battlefield sites. In 1889, you're seeing Congress designate Casa Grande Ruin in Arizona, and that's going to be the nation's first national monument. And they're going to be appropriating $2,000 to protect it at that time. So this is going to be the first federal funding ever allocated for historic preservation. And that's only 113 years after our country gained independence. So again, it's kind of like really early efforts for historic preservation. In 1906, the American Antiquities Act is authorized by the President of the United States to designate national monuments on land owned or controlled by the federal government. So that's kind of where places like I was working, Fort Pulaski National Monument, come about. And that's going to be the United States' first law to provide general protection for general kinds of cultural and natural resources. It's also going to establish the first national historic preservation policy within the United States. This is a lot to go over, but just bear with me. In 1916, you're seeing the National Park Service become established within the United States Department of the Interior, and that's going to be an administrative agency for national parks. So today it is the sponsoring agency for most of your federal preservation programs. And when it comes to other things in preservation, you're seeing in 1923, Dr. William Goodwin relocates to this larger picture you're seeing here, Williamsburg, Virginia, and he moves there to become the rector of their local parish church. But he does recognize the historic importance of the town, which at that point had been overlooked for over a century. And so he began at that point a campaign for the town's reconstruction. And he's going to do so with the help of a super wealthy person, John D. Rockefeller. So this becomes the first attempt anywhere to really restore an entire town. And colonial Williamsburg today continues to be one of the most well-known and large preservation efforts that attracts tourists from around the world even. So let's get back to that very first kind of main effort for historic preservation that most people think of, and that's going to be George Washington's Mount Vernon. So the original house that you're seeing here was actually built by George Washington's father, Augustine, around 1734. And George Washington would later expand the house twice. So once in 1750s and once again in the 1770s. And it would remain in Washington's family and as his home for the rest of his life. So let's look at what it looked like in 1859. This is before restoration begins. So you can kind of see the difference between the two. This one's looking a little rough, missing some columns, not looking too great there. That's when this woman comes into play. She actually doesn't kind of start the idea. If you read that quote up at the top, it says, "If the men of America have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero go to ruin, why can't the women of America band together to save it?" Those are the words written in 1853 by a woman named Louisa Bird Cunningham. She actually wrote these words to her daughter, who is pictured here, and that is Anne Pamela Cunningham. And she wrote those words after she was cruising down the Potomac on a nice little boat, and she glances over and sees this home in disrepair. So she writes these words to her daughter, and they did inspire Anne Pamela Cunningham to kind of initiate a saving of this structure. So this is when she's going to found the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1853. She begins fundraising efforts, going around asking everyone she knows for money. And by 1858, she had actually raised over $200,000 to purchase the mansion and the 200 acres around it. So this is going to be the first National Historic Preservation Organization. It is the oldest women's patriotic society in the country, and its pioneering efforts in the field of preservation did set an important precedent and have served as a model for many organizations that are still around today. The association has also pioneered more important preservation concepts, and that's getting down into the idea of archaeological research as a primary source for learning about the past. So she is kind of this pioneering woman in the field of preservation. But when she's going through these efforts to kind of save the building, there were a lot of people who scoffed at the idea, especially the existing owner at that time, Augustine Washington III. So there are some tensions coming about at that point. Civil War is coming around that time. So there's a lot of tension when it comes to finances. So that's kind of the main draw for them to finally sell that property a little later on. So she does gain control of the property. They wanted to originally sell it to the city and then the state, and then eventually it ends up just going into the hands of the association itself. So restoration formally begins in 1859. Then the Civil War hits, it kind of lags, and then after the war, preservation efforts kind of kick up again on that property. And I would say preservation efforts on that property never end. A lot of these older buildings, it continues. So I would say that her effort is still being continued today on that property. So let's talk about early preservation in terms of zoning and programs. We've kind of gone over some early just generalized preservation efforts. So let's start in the 1930s. The first city to establish a historic district with any type of local regulatory control is going to be Charleston, South Carolina. So this is to counter a threat from outsiders. I'm not sure how many of you have visited places like Charleston or Savannah, but they see everyone as an outsider and who are coming to destroy their area at this time. So they believed that these people were dismantling the beauty of their homes. And so the local citizens and planners at that point decided we need to establish a local historic zoning ordinance. They had already had obviously regular zoning ordinances. They wanted it to move into this historic preservation aspect. And that's going to come around in 1931. At that point, they're going to form a local board of architectural review is what they're calling it. They're not saying a preservation board or anything like that. It's being called architectural review. So changes to their buildings and review of new architecture being designed there. So they had the authority to review exterior changes within the district. And that's when you're hearing this term certificate of appropriateness coming around for changes to these buildings as well. The second historic district, it's not shown here, that's being formed in 1936 is the Old French Quarter in New Orleans. And that's going to be followed in 1955 by Philadelphia, and later in 1973, Savannah, Georgia, where I was living. And there are many more coming around at that time as well. So in 1934, let's move a little ahead from the 1931. We've been talking about the Historic American Building Survey. You see that image way off to the left there. Was established in 1934, and that's going to be under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. This is the first and only federal program to document historic buildings, so in their entirety, literally documenting every aspect of the building, interior and exterior. So the survey is covering buildings and structures of all types. That's kind of what makes it big. So it's looking at smallest utilitarian structures, even to the largest and most monumental structures, everything in between. The Department of the Interior's National Park Service did provide administration and funding for this, and they also established a set of rigorous documentation standards. So if you go on the National Parks website and you go to their pages about HABs, you can look through their really intense documentation standards that they have. As a result, the data compiled in this early kind of 1930s effort for HABs, they were kind of trying to document everything. It does remain among the best historic records of early buildings and structures. So even that house museum I was talking about working at in Savannah, Georgia, that was documented by Habs in 1934. So huge set of records. You can look at them online. Many of the buildings that they documented have been demolished, unfortunately. So it is kind of this huge collection of things that you wouldn't be able to see in person even. There is a kind of thing that works hand in hand with HABs, and that's the Historic American Engineering Record, also known as HARE. And that's established in 1969. That one's emphasizing more on technology and engineering. And so that's recording places like canals, railroads, dams, bridges. So things in New York, we have the Erie Canal, Genesee Valley Canal, Genesee Valley Railroad, etc. So you're going to see those things being documented as well. So just a selfless plug here, again, I did work on the Historic American Building Survey for a building in Savannah, Georgia called the First African Baptist Church. That's a church built entirely by enslaved Savannians for use by enslaved Savannians. And before we move on, I just want to talk about these two other pictures over to the right. When it comes to zoning, there have been monumental losses and there have been monumental wins, especially in these early days of historic preservation. So one monumental loss, if you look over to the far right, is Penn Station in New York City. It's demolished in 1963, and that's to make way for what people now can go visit is Madison Square Garden. So this beautiful building used to be located there. A monumental win for us, though, at this time is Grand Central Station in New York City, which narrowly escaped a very intense addition, as you see in this picture, which was a 50-story tower that they wanted to just plop right down on top of the building. And that's happening in the mid-1970s. They wanted that to occur. The case did go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Developer loses the case and the building was saved. And that does happen to be the same exact developer that did demolish Penn Station. So one loss, one win, same developer. And this is an idea of what HABs would look like. So the First African Baptist Church that I worked in, you get down to the nitty-gritty details of the interior, exterior, lighting fixtures. If there's a plug on a wall, you're documenting it. So it's pretty intense. So let's talk about preservation in the United States outside of everything we've already talked about. In 1949, you're seeing the National Trust for Historic Preservation being established. Now, this is a preservation effort in the United States that historically follows two divergent roads. You're seeing private efforts to save significant individual landmark buildings and federal government efforts to protect natural landscapes. So features like parks. These two strands finally do come together through the establishment of this new quasi-public organization, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In 1966, the National Trust for Historic Preservation publishes a report entitled "With Heritage So Rich." If you haven't read it, I do recommend reading it. This influential document illustrates what had been lost in American architectural heritage and proposed an expanded role for preservation supported by the federal government. These recommendations led to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which is undoubtedly the most important historic preservation legislation ever passed by Congress. Among its many provisions, the act does establish the National Register of Historic Places. This is encouraging the concept of locally regulated historic districts, authorized enabling legislation to fund preservation activities. It also encouraged the establishment of state historic preservation offices. You're seeing the establishment of an advisory council on historic preservation, and it defined at that point how federal preservation programs would rely on the voluntary cooperation of homeowners of historic properties and commercial properties and not interfere with private ownership rights. So we'll get more into what that means in a little bit. So why historic preservation? Before we get into the nitty-gritty, why are we even doing this in the first place? You know, why did those early preservation efforts begin in the first place? There's a couple of quotes here, one from the National Historic Preservation Act saying that the preservation of this irreplaceable heritage is in the public interest so that its vital legacy of cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits will be maintained and enriched for future generations of Americans. And the National Trust for Historic Preservation kind of comes up with these 6 other reasons. One is that old buildings have intrinsic value. Number 2, when you tear down an old building, you never know what's being destroyed. So that's kind of going into these documentation things like what got destroyed in that process. Number 3, new businesses prefer old buildings. They want to be able to just move into something that's already there and start working. 4, old buildings attract people. Old buildings have this intrinsic beauty, so people are more attracted to them. 5, old buildings are reminders of a city's culture and complexity. And 6, regret goes only one way. My old boss used to have that as her email signature. It was everywhere. So that's kind of a big statement. So again, why historic preservation? This is the Why Old Places Matter book here. They matter because 1, continuity. Old places create a sense of continuity that helps people feel more balanced, stable, healthy in their lives. Some of that is kind of personal beliefs there. 2, memory. Old places help us remember things, obviously. There's individual identity, and they do embody a community's identity in general. They embody our civic state, national and universal identities. They're beautiful, and beauty is profoundly beneficial to a community, especially in terms of wanting to have like a cohesive community. And we could go through these for years talking about why each one of these is important, but I don't want to talk too much to everybody in the middle of their day. But I do want to talk about, you see that word up there, number 11, sustainability. Old places, through their embedded energy, the avoided impacts of demolition and new construction, and the use of traditional design features compatible with local climates and locations. It's like this close to existing infrastructure. It's all inherently green. What preservation is trying to do is kind of a big sustainability green effort for a community. Let's go on here. So let's talk about who is doing these efforts, like who's in control of them. There's a government side and there's going to be a private nonprofit sector. When it comes to your local communities, you have your governmental organizations like your city or village or town. You're going to have on your private sector, places like us, the Landmark Society of Western New York. You're going to have places like in the southern tier, like Historic Elmira, Historic Ithaca. You're going to have from the state level, your SHPO office or State Historic Preservation Office. And on the private sector of the state, you're going to have places like the Preservation League of New York State. So they're able to give you grants and other preservation advocacy and things like that. On the national level, you're getting people that we've already talked about, like the National Park Service. On the private side, you're getting the National Trust for Historic Preservation that we already talked about. And so what are these people doing? Let's start with the private nonprofit sector. People like us on the local, state, and national level, we're all trying to have that same end goal, and that's to inform people about historic preservation. Let's say we want to give people advice on historic preservation. If you don't know what you want to do to your building, organizations like us can come in and help you kind of figure out what to do with it. We're out there giving advocacy for buildings. If a building is being threatened for demolition, groups like Landmark Society, Preservation League, National Trust for Historic Preservation can come in and kind of form advocacy for those buildings and try and counteract that effort. There's going to be grant funding, like I said, Preservation League of New York State, huge grant funding opportunity in New York. The National Trust has grants, Landmark Society has some form of grants going on. And we're all out there trying to educate. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. We're out here doing public education for groups, schools, homeowners, communities. We're going around trying to educate everybody. On the government side, though, it kind of differs. local, state, and national. So on a local level, you have your city, like I said, village, and towns. Their efforts are more on individual listings for like a landmark designation in your local community, and local preservation districts, which we'll talk about a little more later too. On a state level, you have, like I said, your SHPO. So it's your State Historic Preservation Office, and they're working more on a state and national register level. So that's going to be individual listings, historic districts, as well as state and federal rehab tax credits. And then on a national level, the National Park Service is administering things, trying to get, again, National Register listed individual listings and historic districts. And there we see that word federal rehab tax credits again. So moving into people like us. So we're the Landmark Society, and who we are is a nonprofit 501c3. We're a membership-based organization. We are one of the oldest in the country. We were founded in 1937, and we serve mainly a 9-county area, but I put in parentheses at the end there, you see, and more, because we're working with places well beyond the 9 counties as well, but mainly it's Monroe, Wayne, Seneca, Ontario, Yates, Livingston, Wyoming, Genesee, and Orleans counties. But we do work with people outside of that bounds as well. So what groups like us do and what we do is we become stewards a lot of times for historic sites. So you see down in the bottom left, that red building, that is Stone Tolan. That is one of the historic sites that we are the stewards for. We hold public events. We do public outreach and education such as this. Again, I mentioned advocacy. We do have a yearly statewide preservation conference. We can even go as little as going down to, if someone calls us, we can give, like I said, advice on what to do when it comes to historic preservation. We're constantly forming partnerships with people around the community. Like right now, we're working with the local community on efforts to find out what to do to counteract some things that happened there. I won't get into it, a little political. We do support local communities, and we assist property owners, developers, local governments, neighborhood and community leaders on anything really regarding historic preservation. And who else is doing this? It doesn't just have to be those people that we've already mentioned. It can get down to preservation consulting groups. So these can be private LLCs. You have architects and landscape architects. So in the Southern Tier, you have people like Johnson Schmidt and Associate Architects. That's a picture I grabbed here because I like that they kept their interior office within this home. Well, it's an apartment. You have people like city planners, preservation planners. You have local, just people who live in a community. We're going to call them grassroots advocates for historic preservation, and even down to homeowners and developers. These are all people who can perform these tasks and who do become trained in historic preservation. So all of you can be historic preservationists. All of these people do have to work within a certain regulatory boundary. Communities have preservation ordinances, which come with design standards and preservation standards. But you can't have these standards without first having created a set of guidelines on how to create these standards. So what happens before you ever need to create design guidelines? I know a big part of what Sarah had wanted us to talk about was design guidelines. It's a strange kind of important piece to historic preservation when it comes to zoning regulation and ordinances. So let's talk about that. So first, you're going to go through these kind of steps, and then I'm going to kind of go in detail about what each of them means. So we need to perform a historic resources survey for an area. So let's say you're in a village and you think this village deserves to be preserved. It deserves to have some sort of district. It needs something. So you're performing a historic resources survey, and groups like us, preservation nonprofits, can go in and do these surveys. And this is in an effort to receive a determination of eligibility that you would get from the State Historic Preservation Office. Again, I'm going to get more in detail with that in just a little bit, though. Beyond that, you'll need to apply for becoming a National Register district. And at that point, you would determine if the community would like to become a local historic district even beyond that National Register district, and that's where your ordinances and standards would come into play. But even before ordinances and standards come into play, and you become a local historic district, you need to set up your guidelines for what these standards are going to be created off of. So let's kind of talk about that first step I mentioned. The National Register, you've heard many times I've said that word, but the New York State Historic, the official list of the national level historic, the nation's historic places worthy of preservation are listed here. It's an honorary program. A lot of people are scared that if you want to become a National Register district, that you're losing rights to your home, people can tell you what to do, that kind of stuff. No, this is an honorary program administered by the State Historic Preservation Office. And kind of the main reason a lot of us advocate for becoming this National Register district is because it opens the door. It is the gateway for tax credits, and then later on local preservation districts. So to become a National Register district, here are some criterion listed there on what they would review it for, review it by. Criterion A, the resources associated with events that have made a contribution to our broad pattern of history. Criterion B, associated with the life of the significant person. Criterion C, it is architecturally significant, it is of an important design, construction method, etc. Criterion D, it's important for its archaeology. So they're reviewing it through those criterion. And as I said, if you do become one of these districts, it is that gateway to tax credits. I'm just going to talk a little bit about tax credits. New York State specifically has the Historic Homeownership Rehabilitation Credit, and it's for the rehabilitation of historic residential buildings, which may qualify for this tax incentive. The credit offers a state income tax credit equal to 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenses associated with repair, maintenance, and upgrades to these historic homes. The value of the credit is applied to your New York State tax liability, which is just to reduce the amount you owe. So the program covers 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenses up to a credit value of $50,000 per year. So how do you become one of these districts? It's kind of a lengthy process. Don't be afraid of it though. So first, you're going to go through the process of a historic resources survey. All preservation activities begin with knowing what historic resources exist, what you have within that space, that community. So what exactly is a survey? A survey is consisting of collecting and recording information about existing historic resources. A lot of times it's 50 years old or older and within a given boundary. Typical survey information is going to include an architectural description of the resource, photographs of the resource, field notes on its age, history, setting, geographical location. With this, the National Register of Historic Places can determine eligibility. So let's talk about that for a second. Determination of eligibility. Once you have your survey done, it's completed, the information, along with preliminary eligibility applications, which you would have to fill out, go to the state's Historic Preservation Office, so SHPO. And from there, they will go over that documentation and determine if they feel as though the district is eligible for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places. Beyond that, it's going to go through the nomination process. So that's where a lot of communities do bring in groups like the Landmark Society to fill out these nomination forms and write the entire nomination in general. So state level review process would begin after a completed nomination form is received by the State Historic Preservation Office. And then they determine whether it appears to meet the National Register criteria that I had talked about previously. If determined complete and there's no other information needed, the nomination will then move on for review by the National Register Review Board. A lot of times we just call it the State Review Board. Then once it gets to the review board, The National Register staff is going to formally present that nomination to the board. The board formally votes on it, and you either become or don't become a National Register district at that point. So let's move on. Let's see. So you've become a National Register district. Let's say you want to go beyond that. Let's say you want to become a local preservation district. You want to get the community involved. You want to have it be your own thing that your community has control over. So again, like I said, all preservation activities usually start with a historic resources survey. So a lot of times the town, even though you have that National Register Historic Resources Survey, you want to get more in depth. You want to have your local community have a historic resources survey get done, and that's going to help later on when you're forming design guidelines. Again, you determine its eligibility. Do you even want to really move forward with creating this local preservation district? And then you're going to get into some of the more important steps. So step 3 here, you're seeing neighborhood and community will build standards. You need to get the community involved. Who knows the community better than itself, right? So the community, along with whoever's assisting in this process, whether it be the planning commission itself, whether it be a nonprofit working with them, these are the people who are going to develop the design standards that are going to reflect the character of the proposed district and are going to be the people who want to formalize and create a boundary map. The information created during this step is what's going to be utilized to complete your applications and such that you're moving forward with to your zoning board or whoever's in control of that. Because you're going to, if you want to become one of these local historic districts, you're going to need to amend the existing zoning ordinance of that community because you're adding this into these zoning ordinances. So that's where you're going to apply for a text and map amendment to the zoning code to include this as a portion of it. So that's going to get reviewed by planning board and so on and so forth to city council, and then you can become a local historic district, which would have review over design changes to buildings, new construction if you want, and these would all be required to receive a COA as a preservation district. So that's where these design guidelines come into play. I'm just showing an example here of the process of kind of creating design guidelines. A lot of it is visual and bullet pointed kind of aspects of a building. So I'm going to come back to this page as we need to kind of flip-flop back and forth. So what design guidelines can and cannot do for you? They can explain, expand, and interpret general design criteria in the local preservation ordinance. They can help reinforce the character of a historic area and protect its visual aspects. They can protect the value of public and private investment. They can indicate which approaches to a design a community encourages as well as discourages, and they can serve as a tool for designers and their clients to use in making preliminary design decisions, and they can increase public awareness. But what they cannot do. So let's first think about how you're going to use the design guidelines. They cannot serve the same legal purpose as the design review provisions of an ordinance. Because remember, the ordinance is the law and the design review criteria are part of the law, but they are not the law. So design guidelines are not in and of themselves mandatory like an ordinance is and should not be confused with the ordinance. In most cases, guidelines are just that. They're helpful, interpretive, explanatory recommendations of what to do. So you need to analyze your district's character. So let's talk about more what they cannot do. Design guidelines, like I said, are not laws. They cannot limit growth or regulate where growth takes place. Guidelines address only the visual impact of individual work. So beyond that, zoning comes into play and it's going to change up everything. So you're really just looking with design guidelines, you're looking at the visual aspects of the buildings. They cannot, they cannot address through zoning ordinances of preservation planning. They cannot be addressed through. So really all these fancy words that you're reading through, are just saying that design guidelines are just that. They're guidelines to look at. And you're using them to form these portions of the zoning ordinance, but they're not, in control of it. So like I said, we're going to go through and we're going to analyze a district's character. It's essential to have a clear understanding of the history of the district, how the history is reflected by its physical characteristics. That's going to be things such as the architecture, landscape, street plan. Ideally, the buildings, streetscapes, and settings should be identified in the district's nomination package. So if you had become, if you're applying to become a district, you have all these things in place, right? So you've kind of started your guidelines already. Has the district evolved over time? Does it represent one period in time? Is there a broad spectrum of period of time? So you need to decide what exactly is going to need protection. So you're identifying historic preservation goals and district needs at that point. Will buildings in the district be preserved as is? Will you allow rehabilitation for new uses? Or are you restoring them to an earlier appearance? Will different approaches to work be applied depending upon the significance, use, and interpretation? It gets really intense and in detail what you need to do. So in this section of creating these guidelines, you're going to need to identify the approach or approaches to work that will protect the historic value and significant features of the district. So that being preservation, rehabilitation, or restoration. You're going to want to include general standards or principles for all the treatments which the guidelines will be written. The guidelines, however, should be custom tailored to a specific community with a particular history and characteristic for that district. For example, if a town has 6 districts, they may differ in appearance and the kinds of work needed to protect them, then each one should have a specific set of guidelines. So you would need to create separate sets for each one of those districts. You're going to want to review, when you're looking at design guidelines, other districts' guidelines. You want to look at how other historic districts developed their design guidelines in order to prevent reinventing the wheel. If you have a community very similar to another, that's already been created. You don't need to rewrite everything in history again. You may even want to get down and just choose basic elements that apply to your own historic district and adapt them to yours. Especially note successful methods of illustrating preservation concepts. So again, a lot of people have illustrations within their design guidelines. So you're writing specific guidelines, like I said, for a district. Design guidelines are going to address special character of your district and the work needed to protect it. So at this point, you're going to draft an illustrated history. That's going to identify significant and distinctive characters and features of the district. So again, buildings, things, landscapes, things like that. When it gets down to creating them, a lot of times you'll see the use of photographs or drawings throughout to reinforce key points. That can all be part of one of those initial survey kind of ideas. When you're doing your survey, you're taking all these photographs, right? Why not go in at that point and you're looking at those key aspects of these specific architectural features? These are all things that you can use when creating these design guidelines. So the use of photos and drawings throughout does reinforce key points and is strongly recommended. Information on materials, maintenance, and repair and replacement should be included, as well as guidance on new construction in the district. So if you're seeing a lot of new buildings that just don't fit in, when you're creating design guidelines, you want to maybe talk about how new construction should have features and aspects that kind of make it cohesive with the existing historic community, not necessarily making it look like these historic buildings, but at least fit in with these historic buildings. If you're a community that's wanting to have restoration as a recommendation for treatment within the district, guidelines on those approaches are going to need to be included as well. And that's going to get a little more intense and a little more in depth. Not a lot of communities force people or require people to have restoration of their buildings. They allow for these adaptive rehabilitations and other uses. And you're also, like I mentioned, streetscapes a couple of times. You're going to want to make a guidance on the treatment of streetscapes. A lot of communities get down to even signage within these streetscapes. When I was working in Savannah, Georgia, one of the longest sign ordinances I've ever seen. It was very intense. And then you're also, a lot of communities like here in Rochester, they include landscape features even as an integral part of their publication of these design guidelines, and then later on becoming ordinance. So it's going to be things, you know, like trees, bushes, what kinds of trees and bushes you can plant. It does get in depth that way as well. These design guidelines, you're going to want to review them a lot. While in final draft, you're going to review the guidelines, and you're going to want to ask yourself a number of questions. Are they consistent with the provisions of the local ordinance that already exists? Do they achieve the original goals of that original ordinance? Because you don't want to veer too far from an existing master plan for a city, you know? So you're going to be figuring out if they conflict with the ordinance and other codes that exist within your community. If you want the Secretary of Interior standards used, do your guidelines agree with the principles of these standards? You'll see a lot of times, let's say someone's applying for a tax credit from the state. These are going to be reviewed by the state, and the state's going to utilize the Secretary of Interior standards when reviewing things for tax credits. If your local ordinance for your preservation district differs from that, it doesn't matter. The state's going to review it based on the Secretary of Interior standards. So you're going to most likely want your guidelines for your community to agree with the standards. And you're going to want to make sure that they're consistent with the particular needs of a district on top of that. So does it conform with the Secretary of Interior standards and comply with what your community needs are? And how are you using these guidelines? Are they truly advisory in nature, or can we call them standards or criteria? Because we want them to make them requirements. So if you are wording your design guidelines, and in portions of it you say, but this should be standard. That's you saying this is definitely what the ordinance should be worded as. So answering questions like these ahead of times are going to help, you know, further down the line. Why would you need these specific local design guidelines? Here's a really long quote from the Secretary of Interior standards. The Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation are very broad, general philosophical principles developed by the federal government for reviewing project work on individual buildings receiving federal grant funds and tax credits. But a historic district is a collection of buildings, sites, and settings that share a common history, appearance, and special meaning in time and place. So typical work projects in historic districts have a visual impact on the distinctive character of adjacent structures, streetscapes, larger setting. It makes better administrative sense to create a local specific design guideline based on principles of the standards. So again, talking about you're designing your guidelines based off the Secretary of standards, but the use of the standards themselves to review the work proposal for a certificate of appropriateness. So saying, use the Secretary of Interior standards, kind of meld them to your specific community. So again, looking at specific buildings. For instance, when the design standards were being created for Italianate structures within the city of Rochester, you're seeing these kind of just basic ideas coming about. The Italianate style was loosely based on the model of a Tuscan villa. Several prominent examples exist in the Mount Hope, Cornhill, East Avenue, and Susan B. Anthony district. So that's showing you when they're creating their design guidelines, they're saying we want to specifically write it for these areas, as well as many ordinary or vernacular houses that display some Italianate inspired features. And then you get down to what those characteristic features include. Italianate structures are usually 3 to 4 story towers included with arched openings or a cupola. You see low hipped roofs, deep roof overhang with brackets, window openings that are either flat or round arched, double leafed doors, 6/6 or 2/2 windows, and small front entry porches. So it's these general ideas. And then if you're writing your ordinances, which includes the standards based on these design guidelines, you can say, within this district, if it's an Italianate home, it must have 6/6 or 2/2 windows. It must include 3 or 4-story tower, must include a low hipped roof, and you can get down into the details. A lot of cities even say that overhang must be no smaller than 12 inches. The eaves must be, and then they have some specific sizing. And that again is going to be based on your survey, right? If you see that all of your Italianate structures have those certain aspects, you can write that in there. You'll also see things like off to the left, placement of buildings, and how these guidelines show no or yes. It can literally be that easy when you're designing a guideline. It's literally just you going through your community, seeing what exists, and trying to maintain that existing, those existing elements. But it goes beyond that. I know we talked about design standards today, but it goes well beyond that. If you're creating an ordinance for a historic district, it can include many things. These are just things that I pulled from different communities around the area. They include the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. When I was working in Savannah, our ordinance allowed us the use of every aspect within the Secretary of Interior standards. So down to mortar types being used, paint types, things like that. You can include visual compatibility criteria. So that again is going to go into your new construction. You have your design standards for the historic houses and alterations that are happening, but you can use visual compatibility criteria to say, we want these buildings to fit into these historic neighborhoods, but not be a historic structure. You can create character areas. You see this in most communities. So let's say you have a riverfront section of town. You can call that your River Street character area, because those buildings are most likely going to differ from the rest of the buildings in that portion of town. You'll see things like large scale development standards. This is a way to stop massive development within your small historic community. You see bonus story criteria. You know, if you're doing something special with your building to make it fit more into the community, maybe we do allow this person to build a little higher. And you see special exception criteria, because again, every building, every town has something different. And maybe this one portion of your town has an insane slope. And so you have to have the special exception criteria to allow for something different to be built specifically on that one site. So these ordinances go well beyond design standards. Design standards are important, but it goes well beyond that. And I didn't want to hold everyone for too long. So that is everything I had for you today. I will open for questions. I'm sure people have more questions about design standards themselves, but I wanted to open it back up to Sarah, and thank you all for listening to me. I talk very fast, so I apologize for that. But if there's anyone who has questions, I'm sure we can go through and answer them.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. That was a really good presentation.